What we thought we would start this with is an overview look at how agriculture has changed, some of the trends that are going on now, and how that has changed the threat profile. Some of the changes are helping us when we're thinking about dealing with emergencies. Some of the changes we need to account for in our programs. I'll do this in three different ways, or in three different parts. First, describing what's been happening over the last few decades. Then we'll talk about looking at some of the trends, the characteristics that increase vulnerability. And then we're going to finish by talking about some of the lessons we should have learned in past events, some going back several years, some going back just a very short while. But first, what is animal agriculture's role in U.S. agriculture? Much of the data I'm going to be working with are from the 2007 Census of Agriculture, USDA does. This one lists the top 10 sectors within agriculture based on their sales. If you add up those sales and then take a look at the cumulative proportion those top 10 make, you'll see they comprise 98% of all agricultural economic activity in this country. So when we say the top 10, we're largely talking about almost all of agriculture. Animal agriculture occupies 4 of the top 6 of those segments. And when you start accounting for what that comes out to be, it means that just on this basis alone, animal agriculture comprises about 50% of all of the U.S. ag economic activity. But our impact is actually much greater than that because we are primary clients for food crops. We are almost the only client for some of these hay and other crops. We consume the cottonseed that is left over. So when you see the ripple effects, our fingers are in so much else of it, our actual impact in agriculture is much larger than 50% of all activity. So we're big, we're important. We also are a little bit different from most of other farms. If you think of farming in general, it is scattered throughout the country. But in animal agriculture, we are regionalizing. And I wanted to show you some maps that have come also from the Census of Ag that show that. This is the first one that's going to be taking a look at where broiler chickens are raised. Broiler chickens are a southeastern U.S. industry. All right. They go from the Mid-Atlantic through to the Gulf states. Now understand, folks in Wyoming do eat buffalo wings. All right? Well, what that means then is that the product, the birds, all this with refrigeration, everything else has to be coordinated and make it to Wyoming in a good fashion. So we are highly dependent on transportation. The more we regionalize, the more dependent we are on transportation and therefore on the energy that supplies that transportation. This is a similar map, but a little bit different in looking at pigs, in that it looks at the change in pig populations from 2002 to 2007. These are supposed to be red dots. Red dots indicate where the industry has been shrinking or disappearing. The blue dots show where it has grown over those 5 years. No big surprise. You've got North Carolina, you've got the region from Indiana through to Minnesota, and then the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma. Again, people in Oregon eat bacon. Folks in New Hampshire have pork chops. That means that this product has to be very transportation dependent, has to be moved, has to have a coordinated supply chain in order to get from primary production through to consumption. This is the map of beef cattle. Quite a bit different from some of the others. You can see a generalized pinkish trend all throughout much of the country where small cattle farms are going away. But look at the growth in the feeding range from the high plains into the upper plains, northern plains area. 80% of our cattle are fed in this little bit of an oval. There is also activity in Idaho, southern Arizona, and the Central Valley of California. This is getting to sound like a broken record, but people in Las Vegas eat steak. So again, moving the product from where it is raised, where it's processed, to where the consumers are is a major issue, therefore very transport and energy dependent. The last one I'm going to show you is the last of our major animal agriculture commodity groups. This is the dairy industry, and it has largely moved out west. You have the red sign showing general decrease throughout much of the east, and major activity, West Texas, southern Idaho, and the Central Valley of California. The dairy industry also shows us something else in here, in that it's a really good example of another trend that has been going on in agriculture in general, is that is a decreasing number of farms and an increasing size of that average farm. And I'll show you what I mean by looking here. Since 1991, the national number of dairy herds has dropped by about 40%, whereas the number of cows has only dropped by a few percentage. Right? It doesn't take a mathematical genius to realize that means the average farm has had to have gotten bigger. But it hasn't been a really consistent effort. This chart shows you the breakdown of where our dairy farms based on herd size, going from the dark green being herds of less than 30, all the way through the bright blue being herds that are over 500 cows. If you look at it, this group of herds that is 500 cows and higher comprised only 4% of the national dairy herd in 2006. It was a growing segment, but it was still, when you looked at it by number of farms, a fairly minor aspect of the dairy industry. But then the other way to ask the question is, where do our dairy cows actually live? That is shown in this chart, where it takes a look at cow numbers, again broken down by herd size. When you look at that, you will see these 4% of dairies owned 47% of the nation's dairy cows. Those herds tend to be higher producing herds than the average, so in actuality they produced over 54% of all the milk in the U.S. in 2006. In 2009, herds over 500 produced 6 out of every 10 gallons of milk produced in this country. So you're getting a high concentration of the entire market share in a very small proportion of the industry. We are seeing that across the board in animal ag, in crop agriculture, in transport, and I'll show you some of those data in a minute. So just looking at some of those trends in modern agriculture, what does it mean? It means, one, we are very important. If we get hurt because we feed through so much else of agriculture, we will hurt lots of other parts of agriculture. Again, repeating what Matt said, it's unfortunate we can't get some of those other parts to come and talk to us. It's getting to be very large scale. Fewer but bigger farms, more densely populated farms. They're regionally developing into what we call production centers, where we have, as in the dairy industry, the Central Valley of California, West Texas, southern Idaho. The farms that are in these production centers, these are the big ones, but these are farms that have access to expertise, to resources, to support structures that hardly exist in other parts of the country. That means in an animal health emergency, we can ask and expect different things from them than we can from farms that are just isolated, smaller kinds of operations. We need to account for that when we are developing our programs. And then lastly, as I mentioned multiple times, they are very transportation energy dependent. And as oil goes well over $100 a barrel, it's going to be more difficult to move pigs from North Carolina to Wyoming. It's going to be more difficult to move chicken from Arkansas to New Hampshire. We'll figure out how to do it, but it's going to be more expensive. So let's look now at some of the characteristics that increase agriculture's vulnerability. Some of them we've already talked about, and we'll just review them again in the light of vulnerability, but I'm going to bring up a few others. One of the first things we have to keep in mind, even though we're talking about animal health emergencies, is when I talk to any of my dairy clients, they aren't asking me what's happened to foot and mouth disease, what's going on with Rift Valley fever. They're worried about, in North Carolina, we just got through the ice storm season. They've got a breather, and now next they're going to be worried about hurricanes, because weather is the major element that really causes problems for them. And in fact, if you go over the last 30 years, you can take a look at the number of billion-dollar weather events. That's billion with a B by state. I've outlined in white the sections of the country that have ranged anywhere from having one such event every other year to actually having more than one event on average per year. So the yellow colors are the ones that are having billion-dollar weather events once every other year, and at the extreme, the gray colors are the ones that have more than one such event every year. I live here. We are right now here. 2 of them gray states. Major areas that get hit. It's not surprising the worst of these states are in Hurricane Alley. Where this really is relevant to livestock is if you take an amalgamation of those maps I just showed you and put on top of this where our livestock actually live. And you can see the majority of our livestock live in these high-risk weather states. North Carolina with pigs and poultry. Poultry all through here. Here we have the beef cattle, largely. Swine. And there's the dairy industry out there. So our animals live in these areas of high vulnerability to weather. So any animal emergency management program we design has to first and foremost remember that. Otherwise, we're going to be devising programs that are going to ignore a major issue for them. But there are other things that are going on in the industry that increase our vulnerability. Some of it has to do with just the increased mobility of people and products. I've already talked about how much things have to move. Pathogens can follow along on that. The larger, more densely populated farms, increase in concentration, both geographically, but genetically, and as well as with ownership. And we'll talk about ownership more in a second. And then lastly is that our supply chains are becoming more complex and they're becoming much more lean, highly efficient. But you need to remember, anytime anybody talks about a very efficient supply chain, that efficiency is usually bought at the price of jettisoning our surge capacity. What is seen by an accountant as fat that can be removed is very often the thing that gives us resilience when things don't go right. And we'll talk about that in a second. But first, let's talk about ownership, the concentration of ownership. This is just a set of statements over the last decade throughout food and agriculture as well as our support industries showing how industry ownership concentration has really increased. I've got exporters, processors, transportation, primary production, retail. All of these are seeing the same kinds of trends in here. Since we're in Texas, let's talk about beef cattle. In 2002, 4 meat packers met 81% of the market. By 2008, 6% of the feedlots produced 67% of the fed cattle. Very similar to what I was talking about in the dairy industry, where 4% of the dairies produced over half of the milk. I'm not one of these people who says all this big stuff is bad, we need to get rid of it, because I look at it from the other side. This high level of concentration carries some tremendous advantages to us in times of emergency, because we have consistent records, consistent communication, consistent management styles, very strong lines of communication when we have this level of concentration. The flip side of it is, even though very good management techniques can be spread across a market very quickly, it also means that bad ideas and pathogens can be spread across markets very quickly. So it carries pros, it carries cons, and it's up to us to realize that it just changes the risk profile, the landscape over which we work. Because if we assume this isn't happening, our programs are going to completely miss some of the strengths, the benefits they offer us, as well as some of the deficits they offer. The other aspect I wanted to talk a little bit about was the last item, was the complexity of the supply chain. And I'm going to look at 2 very different sectors in animal agriculture: swine production and beef production. We'll start with swine production using the kind of North Carolina large-scale model. The supply chain starts with resources. In this image, it just is being shown as being feed, but you could talk about medication, you could talk about water, you could talk about labor supply, anything that is a resource that goes into producing these animals. They have their own supply chain of their own. In swine production, we have a grandparent line, and then we have typically what's called a 3-site production process. Here we have the high-value grandparent lines, multiplier units that produce the production sows. The production sows are in nursery units that produce pigs, and then the pigs are grown in what are called finishing units. Some of these will belong to the same farm, the same company. Some of them may change over, but all these animals have to be moved. And for this person to move feeder pigs to a finishing unit, it means this place must have moved a bunch of pigs out to make room for it. So it is this finely choreographed process of being able to move animals, move resources just in time to be able to make the system work. And it's one of the most efficient systems we've ever seen. But again, you buy efficiency at losing your ability to face surges, to have things go wrong and be able to adapt to them. Once they leave the live animal market, here in this simplistic view, we have high-end, high value versus low value products, goes into distribution, including import-export, and finally goes through retail, restaurant, institutions to the end consumer. But again, if something happens here, stopping the flow at this point, it's like putting up a dam, and the entire system starts to back up behind it, and the system starts to drain out in front of it because we have very little surge capacity. What we have works exceptionally well when everything's going right. Most of the time, everything goes right. But we're talking about situations when they don't, and that's when I get worried. Let's contrast pork production with beef production. Pork production, we have extreme communication and coordination all the way through the supply chain. I don't think anybody would ever claim we have that going on in the beef industry. You have, again, a small seed stock grandparent line going to a huge, this is not to scale, commercial cow-calf. I think every state just about in the country has cow-calf operators. Very small, 15 to 20 cows, what I call one-bull herds kind of things. They move their animals sometimes seasonally, sometimes at random, either into stocker or into feedlots. And this is the first area where we have some real concentration. Remember that 6% of feedlots produce 67% of the fed beef. They move then into the packers, 4 firms controlling 81%, and then it moves into final consumption. The beef market works primarily by going through these wonderful things we call auction markets, sales yards, sale barns. And they seem to be this entity that was purposefully designed to keep us from being able to trace who came in, who went out, and it brings everybody together under stress, commingles them to optimize transmission of disease, and then sends them out. It's a very difficult situation to be able to deal with, to be able to control, and it is one of the major scary issues should we get some kind of a long-term simmering kind of foreign animal disease in our beef cattle. So, ag's vulnerabilities. Geography, going into these production centers, unfortunately, a lot of these production centers are in high-risk weather areas. We are having fewer firms, owners, controlling larger parts of the market. That is both good and bad when we're talking about emergency management. We just need to realize it. They are very efficient, but they're very brittle to change. Again, having lost that surge capacity. Exceptionally dependent on transportation and energy, and they have, in some instances, market structures that almost work against us in trying to protect animal health and protect our markets. So let's close this by talking about some of the lessons we have learned or should have learned from past events. We'll be talking primarily about foot and mouth disease here, but at the end we'll talk about a few other issues. Probably the most studied foreign animal disease outbreak was the United Kingdom in 2001 with foot and mouth disease. This is the epidemic curve. The blue is the weekly average number of cases. Started in late February, peaked March pretty much dropped down by mid-April, and then it went on for 5 more months. 70% of the cases occurred in the first 8 weeks of this outbreak. It hit its peak 4 weeks into it. If you ever thought we had some time to be able to get supplies, to get people trained, to get things going, this graph should disabuse you of that notion immediately. It cost about $6 billion, depending on which source you use. I've seen costs anywhere from $6 to $9 billion. But over half of that was the damage it did to tourism. And one of the main messages that comes out of this outbreak and so many of the others is that the damage that occurs in agriculture is usually very small compared to the overall amount of economic damage it does to society as a whole. In the United Kingdom, the social costs were 4.5 times bigger than agricultural costs of getting the disease under control. This is damage to tourism, lost jobs, this was lost tax revenues. They followed what was then and is still considered the first option by most non-infected countries, which is stamping out without vaccination. They had gone through budget cuts, so they didn't have a very good surveillance system out there. They had too few early responders. That gave them a very slow initial start, and the entire globe was horrified with what they saw of millions of animals in the burning pyres, the entire English countryside appearing to be in flames. Most people stopped talking about foot and mouth disease in the UK with that, but these agents are insidious. The damage that they do to our infrastructure, the support systems, carries on long after the virus is gone. And this chart shows you the census that was done in the United Kingdom starting a few years before the disease outbreak, 2002 the year after, and 2003 2 years after this outbreak. All the values on this chart compare against the values in 1997. In 6 years, the number of beef cattle in the United Kingdom had dropped by 17%. The number of dairy animals had dropped by 27%. The number of pigs had dropped by 45%. Think of that. Nearly half the pigs that were in the United Kingdom in 1997 were gone. Knowing how markets work against farms, that probably means well over half the pig farms were gone. Poultry, not affected by foot and mouth disease, seen as a substitutable product, actually went up in this time. So different sectors are going to respond differently depending on the disease agent. One other lesson learned, Taiwan, that was scarily similar to North Carolina in the shape and structure of its pig industry in 97, had foot and mouth disease. They used vaccine as well. This is a breakdown of their costs. I don't want you to get lost in those. Just look at the big pink numbers at the end. Total direct costs of dealing with that disease are $380 million. The actual impact on their society was $3.7 billion. Nearly 10 times larger was the entire social impact than what it was on agriculture. This is huge. This also means that if it's only us talking to ourselves, only animal agriculture talking about this, we're leaving out an awful lot of stakeholders. Because the rest of society pays for what happens here, and we need to enlist them, get better communication. You're going to hear more about that later on. Now just a couple of thoughts of issues we've had with past ideas on how we're going to deal with foreign animal diseases. One of them is most every plan depends on stop movement, which makes total biological sense. Stop all the animals, all the products till you figure out where the disease is. The problem with this is that you're stopping everybody, infecteds as well as non-infecteds. You're shutting down markets and you're penalizing those people who have done the right thing and have stayed uninfected. This is an analysis I did for the North Carolina dairy industry, where we took a look at milk production per cow, or this would be a herd level measure, and how many days a herd can produce milk but not get paid for it, such as would happen on a stop movement, before we've eaten up an entire year's net returns to management. one measure of profit. So we're looking at how long would it take you to take away an entire year's profit. If the program, the disease, does not change the cost revenue structure of the system, the typical 18,000-pound North Carolina dairy will last about 13 days before we will have erased an entire year's hope for profit. However, if the program and the disease conspire to just increase costs relative to revenues by 2%, we will have cut that resiliency in half. And if it raises them to 4%, the day we call for a stop movement, we will start putting dairies into the red. The very day we do that. The longer these go, the more dairies will fail as we go. And again, the issue is that even though high producers will last longer, the numbers are relentless, is that eventually we're going to be hurting healthy farms. These are not infected farms. These are farms that have been caught up, friendly fire, collateral damage, whatever you want to call it, by our program. And, as is the case in most countries, typically we do not pay indemnities to somebody who goes out of business unless they were infected. So we are not only punishing them for doing the right thing, but we're telling them, and since you did the right thing, you're not going to get any help. To me, that just doesn't seem right. If there's any bright story in this, and there are actually some, is that we sometimes over-focus on how big foot and mouth disease can be, and we don't realize that it is not the galactic interstellar boogeyman that we've often made it out to be. It is a virus. It is a virus we can deal with. Much of the world deals with it on a daily basis. Work out of Canada in 2007 followed 24 outbreaks for which they felt there was sufficient data both at the international and the national level to really try and figure out what happened to them. And they showed that the median outbreak was 15 to 16 infected premises. 15 to 16. Okay? That wouldn't be too bad. But that it was really widely variable. And you can see this is a log scale, so don't get confused from 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000. But you can see very many of them had fewer than 10. The majority of them had fewer than or right around 100 premises, and then all of a sudden it makes a jump. It seems there is a tipping point or a stair-step event with one of these highly contagious diseases that if you don't get it under control fairly quickly, certainly it can go big, and in about 20% of the cases it went catastrophically big. That means in 80% of the cases they got it under control. That means for us, we should not always automatically assume foot and mouth disease is going to be a national mobilization event. If we can corral it, if we can keep it in one area, we need to work as hard as we can to keep the rest of the country moving as easily as we can so we don't destroy markets. They found no relation between the time to detection and overall outbreak size, but that raises 2 points. One is because the data on when did the disease actually make the incursion to the country is very questionable. But two, it means just because you identify it, if you mount an insufficient response, it shouldn't surprise any of us that we're not going to have much of an impact. And so I think that's what those data are telling us. The last of my lessons learned brings us back home and brings us back very recently. Talking about spring 2009 with the novel H1N1, the so-called swine flu. You know, I can see people in here involved with the pig industry, and the color is leaving their faces now as soon as I mention this disease and this year. The year before H1N1 emerged, this novel version of it, the North Carolina swine industry primary production was worth about $2.1 billion to the state. Using some typical multiplier values, across all of agriculture in North Carolina, it works out to be about 4.3, meaning for every dollar in primary production that's generated, the state sees $4.3 in overall ag and food economy. If you use that, which is probably conservative for the pig industry, the pig industry was worth nearly $9 billion to us in 2009. April of 2009, we heard about something funny going on in Mexico. Quickly, it was in California. It got named swine flu because it carried many similarities to agents we'd seen in pigs before. Within 10 days, from April 24th to May 4th, 2009, swine industry saw about a $14 per head drop in price. Now remember, this was during the worst of the economic downturn, so they were already losing about $4 a head when they went into this. But what that means is $14 of that total $18 was due to misnaming a virus. 80% of the losses the swine industry took because we called it something wrong. And we all saw how that rippled through retailers, grocery stores, the media. Everybody was positive they were going to get flu from looking at bacon. And we never got around that. We never got beyond it until way late in the winter of 2009, 2010, when the populace finally quit being scared of H1N1. Sticks and stones can hurt my bones, but names can really wipe me out. And that's what we should have learned from H1N1. So when we look at the lessons learned, foot and mouth disease, some of these things can be big, but we should not always expect them to be big, and our plan should be flexible enough to deal with them when they aren't. The social costs, the widespread costs of these diseases far exceed what the actual impacts are on agriculture. So we need all of society involved in it. The damage, sometimes our programs can cause more damage than the diseases. Stop movements, some of the other issues that we have in here, really hammer the people who are doing the right thing. And then lastly, consumer confusion, market confusion. Sometimes we badmouth each other. All of that goes to decrease consumer confidence and scares them away. And those things happen to us because agriculture has changed under our noses. It has brought us a new landscape of threats and benefits that we often do not account for when we're looking at programs. We should learn these lessons. We should enact and work on those lessons, because if we don't, we're just doomed to repeat them again.